world where pain is not questioned, but only accepted, where illness is not a chance occurrence, but a moral judgment, where war, hunger, and pain are not problems to be solved, but punishments to be lived with. This was Europe in the Middle Ages. There were more than just castles, swords, and kings. People lived in a time when an idea ruled everything. This idea was so strong that it made laws, justified cruelty, defined morality, and controlled people's minds. That thought was Adam's sin. People in the Middle Ages didn't just see heaven when they looked up at the sky. They also saw judgment. They didn't think it was unfair when they worked the land until their hands bled. They thought it was fair. And when a baby was born, people were happy and scared at the same time because they all thought the same thing. This kid has Adam's guilt. People often use the story of Adam and Eve as a symbol today, an analogy, a story that teaches moral lessons. But people in the Middle Ages didn't see this story as a symbol at all. It was the truth. And from that truth came a way of seeing the world that shaped an entire civilization. People were told this from the moment they were born. You are not naturally good. Your wants are dangerous. There is a reason for your pain. And your salvation is in the hands of powers you can't control. People didn't just believe this in churches. It determined who was in charge and who followed orders. It told why kings wore crowns and peasants lived in pain. It explained why disobedience was wrong and obedience was right. It turned fear into a way to keep things in order. Law and sin were one and the same in medieval society. Not only was crime against the law, it was also against the spirit. Punishment wasn't just about getting even. It was also about cleaning the soul. That is why executions were done in public, why torture became a ritual, why fear was there. People were supposed to see what life was like after the fall of man. And when disaster struck, when plagues wiped out whole cities, when famine followed war, and when bodies filled the streets, medieval Europe didn't look for scientific answers. It turned around. This is the debt that Adam's sin has to pay. This documentary isn't about a story from the Bible that you already know. It tells the story of how that story became law, psychology, politics, and power. It is about how one thing that happened in Eden was used to explain why the world was broken and why suffering was not only normal, but also necessary. The real question is not what Adam did. The real question is, why did an entire civilization choose to live in the shadow of his sin? If you want to learn more about how one old belief affected fear, authority, morality, and control in medieval Europe, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment with your name, city, and the time you are watching this. This story isn't just from the past. We can still see its shadow. People in the Middle Ages thought there was a world without sin before it became a thing. A world free of guilt. A world in which suffering lacked significance due to its non-existence. This was not just a biblical opening scene. For medieval thinkers, it was the standard by which all human suffering was measured. In the medieval worldview, Eden was not a mythical garden existing outside of time. It was history, true, solid, a lost state of being that proved something important. The world wasn't made broken. It broke. People thought that Adam and Eve lived in perfect harmony before the fall, not just with God, but also with themselves, with nature, and with each other. Their bodies didn't make them feel ashamed. Their work wasn't tiring. Their wants weren't dangerous. The most important thing was that they weren't scared. Medieval theologians posited that prior to the fall, humanity exhibited a clarity of mind that is now absent. Desire was ruled by reason. The will naturally moved toward what was good. There was no conflict between instinct and morality. This idea was very important. If perfection existed, then imperfection necessitated an explanation. That explanation was a sin. In medieval thought, death was not part of the original plan for creation. Being sick wasn't normal. It wasn't necessary to feel pain during childbirth. Hard labor wasn't just work, it was punishment. Everything that makes life hard for people started when Eden was lost. This belief changed how people in the Middle Ages thought about nature. The world around us was no longer neutral. It was hostile, unpredictable, and dangerous because people had messed up God's plan. Storms weren't random. Animals weren't safe. The earth fought back against people because it had been cursed. People didn't even trust their own bodies anymore. Desire was not trustworthy. Pleasure was risky. People thought that hunger, sex, and feelings were signs that the human will was no longer pure. Medieval theology posited that prior to the fall, humans did not engage in internal conflict. After the fall, internal conflict became the most important part of life. This is why writers from the Middle Ages often talked about life as being in exile. People thought that people were living outside of their original home. Eden was not only a place that was lost, it was also a state that could never be fully regained in this life. This belief made a strong emotional difference. It made sense that life was hard. It was normal for society to be unfair. If authority was strict, it was right. A broken present was easier to accept because of the memory of a perfect beginning. But the idea of Eden was not meant to give people hope for a better world. It had a different purpose. It told people in the Middle Ages that perfection was in the past and salvation was in the future. The present, on the other hand, was meant to be lived through. People were often suspicious of efforts to create a perfect society on earth for this reason. People thought it was arrogant to try to bring back Eden through their own work. Only God could fix what Adam had broken. So the world before the fall became a religious anchor. It explained why everyone suffers, why inequality felt like it would never end, why it was more important to be obedient than happy. And most importantly, it strengthened a key belief of the Middle Ages. Humanity was no longer what it should have been. But this makes me uncomfortable. If the world was perfect before the fall and was permanently damaged after it, what happened in that moment of disobedience that changed everything? A single, troubling question was at the heart of medieval thought. Was Adam's sin a historical event or an ongoing condition? The answer was clear for medieval Europe. Adam's disobedience was not regarded as a historical error with minimal repercussions. People thought of it as a permanent break in human life. People didn't forget about the fall. It was something that people lived in. Medieval theology posited that Adam transgressed a commandment. He broke the structure that makes up the human soul. People thought that before the fall, the human will was naturally in line with what was good. Desire was guided by reason. There was no fight to be obedient. Being good was easy. But Adam's decision threw that balance off. Medieval thinkers said that after the fall, the human will split into two parts. People still knew what was right, but they didn't have the willpower to always choose it. This internal rupture became the basis of what subsequent theology termed original sin. Original sin did not imply that every individual replicated Adam's action. It meant something much more troubling. It meant that everyone got the condition that Adam made. From the point of view of the Middle Ages, sin was no longer just something you did. It was a way of being. This is why birth became morally important. A newborn infant had committed no transgression, yet medieval theology asserted that the infant was inherently tainted by Adam's transgression. They didn't learn how to feel guilty. It was passed down. This idea changed how people in the Middle Ages thought about duty. People were no longer judged just by what they did, but also by who they were. Not strong, corrupted, spiritually damaged. The same lens was used to see the world. Because people had fallen, nature suffered. The body fought back against the soul because it had lost control. At first, there was no harmony, so society broke down into a hierarchy. Everything led back to Eden. And since people thought the fall changed human nature, no amount of work could fully fix it. Good deeds were important. Doing the right thing was important, but they were never enough. This is why medieval Christians put more value on grace than on success. Discipline alone did not earn salvation. It needed help from God. Medieval theology posited that without divine assistance, humans would perpetually revert to sin, not out of a desire to rebel, but due to an inability to maintain enduring virtue. This idea had a huge effect on people's minds. People started to expect failure. It became normal to fight. It was no longer possible to be perfect. And this belief in moral failure changed how society kept people in line. If people were naturally prone to sin, then authority was essential. There had to be rules. Discipline was needed. In this view of the world, freedom was a threat. If left unchecked, human desire would only make the same mistake as Adam. Adam's sin became more than just a religious idea. It turned into justification, reasons for strict laws, for strict hierarchies, for a church that said it was the only one that could save people. If sin was passed down, then salvation had to be given. Baptism removed the guilt of the first sin. Confession fixed repeated failure. The church was the link between sinful people and God's mercy. And since everyone thought the fall was universal, no one was outside of this system. Both kings and peasants were sinners, but not all wrongdoers were the same. Those in power said that God gave them the right to rule over those who couldn't rule themselves. Those who followed orders were told that their obedience was like the humility that Adam had lost. So, the fall wasn't just about what happened in the past. It changed what people thought would happen in the future. People in the Middle Ages were taught not to expect perfection in this world. It was impossible to have a perfect world. Justice would never be complete. Pain would always be there. The goal was not to make the world better, but to live through it. But there is a deeper tension beneath this certainty. If Adam's sin permanently harmed human nature, to what extent can individuals be held accountable? If failure was passed down, where did choice end and fate start? This tension was a constant in medieval theology, and it would eventually tear the system apart from the inside. But before those cracks showed up, one person would give this belief its strongest and most lasting form. A man whose ideas would shape how Europeans thought about guilt, freedom, and the soul for hundreds of years. Augustine of Hippo had the biggest impact on how people in the Middle Ages thought about Adam's sin. Adam told the story, and Augustine gave it meaning. His meaning was so important that it shaped how Europe thought about guilt, freedom, desire, and the human soul for more than 1,000 years. Augustine lived in the late 300 seconds and early 400 seconds, when Christianity was still figuring out what it was. The Roman world was not stable. Old moral systems were breaking down, and a very important question was on the minds of Christians. Why do people know what's right but keep doing what's wrong? Augustine did not respond to this question kindly. He gave a very different answer. Augustine, drawing from his own inner struggles with desire, temptation, and self-control, concluded that the issue was not education, culture, or circumstance. The issue was the essence of humanity. Augustine said that Adam's sin did something that couldn't be undone. It didn't just set a bad example. It changed the way the human will works. Augustine taught that before the fall, the human will was truly free. It could choose good things without any problems. It was natural to obey. Virtue did not necessitate internal conflict. That freedom was taken away after the fall, not replaced by complete evil, but by frailty. Augustine contended that humans retain the capacity to discern good, yet lack the internal fortitude to consistently select it. This concept came to be referred to as the bondage of the will. Augustine believed that people did not sin because of outside forces. People did bad things because their wills were broken. They wanted the wrong things. He insisted that this damage was passed down. Augustine thought that Adam's sin was passed down from one generation to the next, not just in a spiritual way, but also through the act of human reproduction. Desire, particularly sexual desire, served as the conduit for the transmission of original sin into the world. This belief had very big effects. It meant that sin wasn't just something you learned to do. It was a part of being human from the moment of conception. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone was guilty, not even babies. This is why Augustine fought so hard for infant baptism. The idea sounds extreme to people today, but in Augustine's view, it made sense. If guilt was passed down, then grace had to be used right away. Salvation could not wait for moral growth. Augustine thought that only God's grace could fix the broken will, and people couldn't call on grace. It was a gift from God that you didn't have to work for. Good deeds were important. Discipline was important, but they couldn't do anything without grace. This lesson changed the moral landscape of Europe in the Middle Ages. People no longer trusted their own work. People were suspicious of self-improvement. Believing in your own goodness was risky. Humility became the most important virtue, not because it was good, but because people thought that pride was a sin that Adam did again. Augustine's thoughts also changed how people thought about freedom. Being free didn't mean being able to choose anything anymore. It meant being able to choose what was right, and Augustine said that ability was gone. It could only be fixed by God. This interpretation fit perfectly with a world that wanted things to be in order. If people were naturally weak, then they needed someone to be in charge. Discipline was needed if desire was corrupted. If the will was broken, then doing what was right was the only way to be saved. Medieval church leaders liked Augustine because his theology gave them something very useful: a psychological reason for control. People didn't just obey because their leaders were strong. They also did it because it felt right to do so. Disobedience was not only defiance of authority, it was a rebellion against one's own sinful nature. Augustine did not create a political system, but his ideas made it possible. Kings ruled because people needed order. Priests were the ones who brought grace to people because they couldn't reach God on their own. People had to hold back their will, not give in to it. So they had to go through pain. Self-doubt turned into a good thing. People thought it was wise to not trust their own wants. To hold back, instinct was holy. To submit was to be safe. Augustine's theology became doctrine over time. What started as a personal fight turned into a way of thinking for the whole organization. It was taught in universities. It was defended by church councils. Law systems took it in. By the High Middle Ages, there was no longer any debate about Augustine's view of people. It was taken for granted. People had found the will was broken, grace was needed, and authority was the line between chaos and salvation. But there was a hidden tension in Augustine's ideas. If humans couldn't choose good without grace, what did responsibility really mean? Was punishment fair if failure was unavoidable? These questions stayed in the back of people's minds during the Middle Ages. They did not go away. They stayed put, and eventually, they would question the very system that Augustine helped build. By the time of the Middle Ages, Adam's sin was no longer just a religious idea. It had turned into a way of thinking about yourself, the world, and your place in it. People in the Middle Ages didn't wake up every day wondering if they were fallen. They thought it was true. People didn't talk about the fall. They felt it. People were taught to not trust themselves from a young age. Wanting something was risky. Pleasure was questionable. People thought that being sure of your own goodness was a sin, which is what destroyed Eden. Medieval thinkers saw the human mind as a battlefield. Reason was on one side, trying to lead the soul to what was right. On the other side was desire, which was always pulling towards sin. This internal conflict was not regarded as psychological intricacy. It was proof that the fall still lived on in everyone. This belief was strengthened by everyday life. People remembered that their bodies were no longer obeying them when they were hungry. Being sick reminded them that the world was broken. Sexual desire reminded them that they had lost control of their will. Even happiness was handled with care. It was okay to laugh as long as it wasn't too much. You could have fun, but only within very strict limits. Too much of anything, whether it's pleasure or curiosity, was dangerous because it could lead to a lack of discipline. Medieval spirituality stressed being alert. Living faithfully meant always looking at yourself. People kept an eye on their thoughts. People questioned their motives. Confession wasn't just about what you did. It was also about why you did it. People learned to ask not just what they did wrong, but also why they wanted to do it. This led to a culture of distrust among people. The self was not trusted. There was no praise for instinct. Freedom was not empowering. It was dangerous. Discipline was a form of protection in this way of thinking. Not to stop happiness, but to stop things from falling apart. Rules were made. Structure kept things in order in a world that was already broken by sin. This way of thinking went far beyond just personal morals. People thought that social roles were a sign of God's order. People didn't think it was unfair if someone was born poor. People thought of it as part of a fallen world where pain had a purpose. Having big dreams was risky. Being happy was a good thing. It was wise to accept one's place. Wanting more was often seen as going against God's plan. Fear was a big part of how people acted. Fear of going to hell. Fear of being punished by God. Fear of making the same mistake as Adam. But this fear wasn't all over the place. It had a structure. Church teachings made it clear what to believe, how to live, when to ask for forgiveness, and where to find hope. This made life in the Middle Ages strangely stable. People lived with worry, but they also lived with certainty. They understood what was wrong with the world. They understood why there was pain. They knew who had the keys to salvation. Adam's sin made everything clear. It told us why self-control was a good thing, why being obedient was holy, why people respected authority. It also changed how people in the Middle Ages thought about change. No one thought there would be progress. History was not a tale of progress. Things were better in the past. The present was broken. The future was in the hands of divine judgment. This point of view made radical change less likely. The church could lead reform, and that was okay. It was suspicious to come up with new ideas without permission. Thinking for yourself could lead to pride, and pride could lead to damnation. People in the Middle Ages didn't think about changing the world. It was all about getting through it. But even though it seemed like everyone was okay with it, there was still tension. If people were broken, and fear controlled their actions, how could real virtue exist? Was obedience significant if it stemmed from fear? Was goodness real if it needed control? People didn't often say these questions out loud, but they stayed quiet, waiting for times of crisis to bring them to the surface. And when power got into this weak mind, the effects would go far beyond what one person thought. In Europe during the Middle Ages, power didn't have to explain itself. People thought it came from God. This belief was based on a simple but strong idea. If people were bad, then order had to come from above. Adam's sin made it seem like hierarchy was not only natural, but also necessary. God was at the top of this structure. The church was below God. Kings stood below the church. Lords stood below kings. And at the bottom were most of the people in the world. People didn't think this was oppression. People thought it was God's plan. Medieval political theory did not inquire into the fairness of hierarchy. It inquired if hierarchy inhibited sin. People thought that kings were in charge because they were morally better, but they were really in charge because they thought that authority would keep things from getting out of hand. The frailty of human nature legitimized a ruler's authority. If people were prone to sin, then unregulated freedom would result in chaos. Obedience thus transformed into a moral obligation. It wasn't just a political act to go against a king. It was a risk to their souls. People thought of kings as God's representatives on earth. People thought that their power was like God's power. This belief did not necessitate kings to possess virtue. They had to be chosen. God could use even a bad ruler to keep things in order. People didn't think that bad leadership was a good reason to rebel. People thought it was just a part of life in a world that had fallen. This system was based on the church. Kings had armies and land, but the church had something much more powerful: salvation. The church said it had power over the human soul through baptism, confession, penance, and absolution. Because Adam's sin was thought to affect everyone, no one was outside the church's reach. The church didn't just teach doctrine. It changed the way things were. The church calendar organized time itself. Its rituals marked the passing of birth, marriage, and death. Theology gave law its moral logic. This made the throne and altar work together. The church was safe because of kings. The church made kings legal. Together, they made a closed system of power. Disobedience became perilous as it jeopardized more than mere order. It put salvation in danger. If people couldn't lead themselves to do good, then authority was seen as kindness, not control. People thought that hierarchy would keep things from getting out of hand. Discipline as love. Punishment as a way to fix things. This way of thinking was very common in everyday life. People who worked on farms were taught that being obedient showed humility. Lords were taught that being in charge meant being responsible. Priests were taught that mediation was a sign of God's grace. Every role had a spiritual meaning. Stepping outside of one's assigned place was to go against God's order. Adam's fall had broken the idea of equality. Medieval theology posited that, prior to Eden, humans existed in equality and harmony. After the fall, it was impossible to avoid inequality. Hierarchy did not cause unfairness. It showed it. This belief made it easier for people in the Middle Ages to accept pain without getting angry. Hard work wasn't taking advantage of someone. It was punishment. Being poor didn't mean you failed. It was spiritual training. Wealth was not a privilege. It was a burden. In theory, at least. In real life, this system gave power to the top and made people at the bottom obey. But it lasted because it fit with the way people thought at the time. A fallen humanity needed help. People who were scared wanted rules. A guilty world wanted to be forgiven. And the church gave all three. But there was a problem with this divine hierarchy. What happened when authority itself became corrupt if it was supposed to keep sin in check? If kings ruled with God's permission, how could tyranny be judged? If the church was responsible for salvation, who was responsible for the church? These questions were risky. They questioned the idea that hierarchy was God's will. They were kept down for hundreds of years, but the system would eventually show cracks because of the weight of power and fear. And those cracks would be most clear in how society treated the weakest members. People in medieval Europe didn't often tell the story of Adam's sin without Eve. And as time went on, Eve became more than just a character in the Bible. She became a symbol that changed how people saw, judged, and controlled women. Adam was often seen as the first person to fall, while Eve was often seen as the first person to fail. Medieval theology did not merely delineate Eve's role in the fall, it made it bigger. Eve was portrayed as the door through which temptation came into the world. People saw her curiosity as a weakness. People thought her persuasion was dangerous. And because Eve was a woman, her story became a way for people to see all women. This interpretation had effects that lasted a long time. A lot of people thought that women were more likely to give in to temptation, more driven by feelings than logic, more likely to lead people in the wrong direction. These weren't just social biases, they were religious beliefs. Medieval thinkers said that if Adam's sin hurt human nature, then Eve's role explained why it was so hard to control desire. The female body became linked to chaos. People were suspicious of menstrual cycles. Pain during childbirth was seen as punishment from God. People thought that female sexuality was a dangerous force that needed to be watched. This fear had an effect on marriage itself. People were allowed to get married, but they didn't usually celebrate it as a happy occasion. It was accepted as a necessity. Sex in marriage was permitted, yet frequently characterized as spiritually perilous. Celibacy was seen as better, more pure, and closer to the state that people had lost. Virginity became a sign of power over the body that had fallen. Being a mother made Eve's curse come back to her. Women were most praised when they showed obedience, silence, and self-control. They were not denied public authority mainly for social reasons, but for spiritual ones. If women were more likely to give in to temptation, they were thought to be unfit to teach doctrine, interpret scripture, or rule. Eve's failure warranted exclusion. This reasoning transcended gender. Blame turned into a way to keep things in order. When something went wrong, people in the Middle Ages looked for a moral reason, and moral causes often needed people to act. It was easy to pick on women. People thought that midwives, healers, widows, and people who lived without male protection were suspicious. People were afraid of what they knew. It was scary that they were free. This way of thinking would later lead to accusations of witchcraft, but it had deep roots in medieval theology. Eve had shown that temptation could look like someone you know. Suffering was also gendered. Pain during childbirth was not regarded as tragic. It was seen as proof. People often thought that women deserved, inherited, and needed their pain. But women also had a huge spiritual responsibility in this system. They were supposed to protect men's virtue, to keep from being tempted, to keep moral order by being humble and obedient. If men fell, women were often blamed for making them want to. The culture of blame worked both ways, but it didn't always work the same way. This way of looking at the world made a paradox. Women were seen as morally weaker, but they were still responsible for keeping society pure. They were not allowed to be in charge, but they were still responsible for keeping virtue alive. Eve's story became a reason to take charge, not just their bodies, but also their voices, goals, and freedom. And because this control was framed as protection from sin, it didn't seem cruel very often. It looked like care. This culture of blame, however, extended beyond gender. Once people understood that sin was passed down and temptation was always there, society needed to be reminded of the consequences all the time. And those reminders would soon be public, harsh, and impossible to ignore. Justice in medieval Europe was not meant to protect people's rights. It was made to help a lost soul. Law was not separate from theology. It came straight from it. If Adam's sin corrupted humanity, then crime was not merely a breach of social order. It was a sign of moral decay within. Every crime had spiritual consequences. Punishment wasn't meant to be fair in the way we think of it now. It was cleansing. This belief turned streets into stages. People could see executions. People could see the punishments. Pain was meant to be seen, not kept secret. Justice was a lesson. The crowd wasn't seeing cruelty for cruelty's sake when a thief lost a hand, a heretic was burned, or a criminal was broken on the wheel. They were seeing what sin deserved. Medieval leaders thought that fear was an important tool. If people were weak, fear kept their desires in check. Punishment was meant to wake up the soul and make it obey again. There was blood on the streets. But that didn't mean justice failed. It showed that the law was doing its job. Law viewed the body as a moral tool. Because the soul couldn't be seen, the body became the place where things were fixed. Pain taught what words couldn't. Punishment often came with confession. Public shame made private guilt even stronger. Justice and remorse were connected. This method was used even for small crimes. Along with theft and violence, blasphemy, disobedience, and moral deviance were also punished. There was no clear line between sin and crime. People were especially afraid of heresy. A heretic did not just believe the wrong things. A heretic put the whole community's morals at risk. A false belief could have led to Adam's rebellion happening again. That is why heresy was seen as a disease. It had to be shown. In it. Gone. This was how courts worked. Confession was more important than evidence. Intent was as important as action. It was okay to use torture to find out the truth that a corrupt will had hidden. If the soul didn't want to confess, the body could be made to do so. This system seems cruel and crazy to people today. But for the people of the Middle Ages, it made sense. If people couldn't be trusted to run their own lives, then the law had to do it all for them. There was mercy, but it had conditions. Forgiveness was often connected to feeling sorry. Grace came after submission. People thought that justice without fear was dangerous. It welcomed chaos. This way of looking at the world also affected social discipline. Public penance rituals made people show that they were sorry. Shame turned into a way to teach morals. The community took part in the punishment, which reinforced the idea of shared responsibility. Everyone was reminded of what would happen if they fell. But underneath the structure of the law was worry. Why did crime keep happening? If punishment was supposed to purify the soul, if fear was meant to stop sin, why did people keep doing it? The continuation of crime strengthened the conviction that sin was profoundly entrenched. It seemed like Adam's curse was coming true over and over again, but this constant violence came at a price. A society based on fear could keep things in order, but it couldn't get rid of doubt. And when disaster struck on a scale that punishment couldn't handle, the law's logic would be pushed to its limits. It wouldn't be criminals who filled the streets soon, but the dead. When disaster struck in medieval Europe, it did not come quietly. It ripped through cities. It cleared out villages. It wiped out whole generations. And when it did, people in the Middle Ages didn't ask how it happened. It wanted to know why. The answer was almost always the same. God was mad. People didn't think of war, famine, and disease as random events or natural cycles. People thought of them as moral responses to a world that had fallen. Adam's sin had already shown why there was pain. Now disaster had confirmed it. People didn't think war was a failure of politics when armies fought and fields burned. It was a correction from God. Famine wasn't caused by bad management when crops failed and hunger spread. It was a punishment. But the plague was the only thing that shook medieval certainty. Millions of people died from the Black Death in the 14th century. In some places, almost half of the people disappeared. There were bodies in homes, on the streets, and in churches. Priests died faster than they could give people their last rites. Death brought down social order. But even after all that destruction, medieval explanations were still religious. It wasn't a coincidence. This was a decision. People thought that the plague was God's way of punishing people for their sins, which they thought were passed down from Adam and multiplied over time. It made sense. If humanity was fallen and sin incited divine wrath, then mass death held significance. It was deserved. This belief had a big effect on how people acted. Some people answered with extreme piety. The streets were full of public processions. People whipped themselves as a form of penance because they thought that pain could please God. The flagellants marched from town to town, hitting their own bodies to get rid of their own guilt. Some people started to blame. Someone must have made God angry. People said that minorities were to blame. People from outside were targeted. People in communities looked for a human reason for God's anger. Fear needed to be told what to do. And Adam's sin set the stage. The plague did not instill religious fear. It made what was already there worse. If death could come without warning, then it was important to always be sorry. Life turned into getting ready for judgment. This way of thinking got stronger during the war. Soldiers marched, thinking they were doing God's will. Winning showed that God was on their side. Losing meant moral failure. Even regular people thought about violence in religious terms. Suffering was not a pointless mess. It was proof that the world was still cursed. This way of thinking made people less likely to fight back. To question disaster was to question God. To protest suffering was to deny the fall. Endurance became a good thing. Hope moved away from solutions on earth. There was medicine, but it wasn't the main thing. Sin was not something that science could control. Prayer was more important than stopping. Confession was more important than healing. People in the Middle Ages didn't think the world could be fixed. It thought that the world could only be lived in. But something started to change. As disasters happened over and over, more and more reasons were given. As prayers failed to stop death, doubts quietly grew. If Adam's sin was the cause of everything, then why did the innocent have to suffer with the guilty? Why did the faithful perish alongside the faithless? These questions were risky. They didn't change people's minds overnight, but they made things less certain. When certainty breaks down, culture looks for new ways to express fear, hope, and meaning. Not by law, not by punishing, but through pictures, by telling stories, by painting visions of heaven and hell right into people's minds. In medieval Europe, fear was instilled not solely through sermons and legislation. It was shown. Images spoke when words weren't enough. A lot of people couldn't read the Bible, but they could read fear that was painted on walls, carved into stone, and acted out in public places. Art became a way for the eyes to see God. Churches were not made to make people feel better. They were made to teach. There were pictures of the Last Judgment all over the walls. Christ sat on a throne of glory, and below him, souls were weighed, sorted, and sent to hell. Heaven looked far away and closed off. Hell was bright, full of people, and violent. Demons ripped flesh apart. Fire burned up bodies. There were screams frozen in paint. In the minds of people in the Middle Ages, these pictures were not symbolic. They were signs. Hell showed what happened when Adam's sin broke people apart and didn't heal. Fear was not an emotional consequence. It was a way to teach. Art made theology into a show. In town squares, plays acted out stories from the Bible. The fall of man was acted out. The pain of sinners was acted out. People didn't just watch these scenes. They saw themselves in them. Each ugly demon stood for desire. Each tortured soul signified failure. Dante's Divine Comedy perfectly captured this way of thinking. Dante did not see hell as a place of chaos. It was well organized. There was a different punishment for each sin. The crime was the reason for each punishment. This confirmed a key idea from the Middle Ages, that the universe had a moral order. Adam's sin had thrown that structure out of whack, but judgment put it back in place. Hell wasn't just a place of pain. It showed that there was justice. Fear framed even happiness. Medieval art didn't often show people being happy and carefree. The smiles were small, bodies were stiff. Pleasure on earth didn't last long. Permanent effects were eternal. Heaven was shown to be calm, organized, and far away. Hell was busy, right now, and hard to forget. This imbalance was planned. Fear was a more reliable motivator for behavior than hope. People were more likely to submit, repent, and obey if they were afraid of repeating Adam's rebellion. Theater went beyond churches. Public ceremonies, penance processions, and executions combined acting with morality. People who watched were also participants. Watching punishment was like practicing being obedient. This culture of fear shaped how people thought from a young age. Kids didn't learn right from wrong by arguing. They learned by seeing things that stuck with them. Sin had a face. There was a way to punish. Consequences had color. But art also showed anxiety. The more fear had to be shown, the less certain things had become. If faith was strong, fear wouldn't have to be repeated. Images became more intense by the end of the Middle Ages. Hell is darker, demons that are more scary. Doubt was growing, which made fear stronger. Art tried to keep a worldview together when it was under stress. But fear can only go so far. People start to ask different questions when they see the same threats over and over. Not about hell, but about power. It's not about punishment, it's about control. And slowly, quietly, the fear theater started to lose its power. Fear, authority, and certainty kept the medieval worldview together for hundreds of years. Adam's scene elucidated suffering. Hierarchy explained who had power. Obeying promised salvation. But no system based on absolute certainty stays unchallenged for long. Cracks started to show up by the end of the Middle Ages. They didn't come as revolutions. They came as questions. Researchers began to observe inconsistencies. If Adam's sin permanently harmed humanity, why did individuals continue to exhibit authentic compassion? If the will was broken, what would moral responsibility mean? Universities evolved into unforeseen arenas of conflict. Theological discourse did not refute the fall. Rather, it commenced an examination of its boundaries. Some philosophers placed greater emphasis on human reason. Others wondered if guilt could really be passed down. These ideas were dangerous not because they didn't believe in God, but because they questioned control. Change in the economy also made things less certain. Trade grew. Cities got bigger. New social classes came into being. People who weren't nobles or peasants started to have more power. This messed up the idea that God had set up a hierarchy. If status could change, maybe the world wasn't as frozen as theology said it was. Plagues also made people doubt. Repeated outbreaks made it less likely that obedience would keep people safe. The righteous perished alongside the wicked. The clergy did not explain why. Confession did not stop sickness. Penance did not stop death. It started to seem like certainty was weak. Corruption in the church made this tension worse. When spiritual authority became political, when indulgences were sold, and when leaders preached humility while living in luxury, the logic of divine hierarchy broke down. What happened when authority openly sinned if it was there to stop sin? This change was shown by artists. Art from the late Middle Ages became darker and more self-reflective. Images were less about the order of the universe and more about the pain of people. Literature became more about the individual. Instead of absolute certainty, writers wrote about doubt, fear, and inner conflict. Faith stayed, but it got harder. People still believed that Adam had sinned, but they were unsure of how it was being used. Was guilt supposed to lead souls or control them? Was fear a way to become virtuous or a way to gain power? These questions did not immediately destroy the medieval system, but they made its base weaker. Belief became less consistent. Les automatique obédience. And when people start to think of other options, authority has to change or break. The world of the Middle Ages was still going on, but it was changing. The sense of certainty that used to make suffering meaningful was going away, and as that certainty faded, new ideas about Adam's sin came to light. Some people would question the church's exclusive right to grace. Some people would completely change how they think about human nature. The long shadow of Eden was starting to move. But before new worlds could fully form, the old belief would leave a mark that would change how people think in ways they didn't expect. Adam's sin didn't go away when the medieval world started to let go of absolute certainty. It took on a new shape. The idea that people were inherently flawed did not stop with castles, monasteries, and Latin sermons. It went along with Europe into the modern era. The Renaissance challenged authority, yet it did not entirely dismiss the concept of a flawed human nature. People were happy about their potential, but they still didn't trust their desires. Reason was praised, but discipline was still praised. People looked into freedom, but they didn't always believe in it. This tension got worse during the Reformation. Reformers questioned the church's authority over salvation, yet many upheld Augustine's perspective on human frailty. Grace became more personal than institutional, but guilt stayed deeply ingrained. The structure changed. The mind stayed strong. When political power and religious authority split, the word sin slowly changed into the words morality, law, and later, psychology. Fallen nature used to be called flawed character. Original sin turned into human weakness. But the assumption remained unchanged. People weren't naturally good. They needed to be held back. This idea had an effect on modern institutions. Legal systems still put punishment ahead of rehabilitation. Discipline was more important than curiosity in school. Governments used people's lack of responsibility to justify their control. Even secular systems inherited theological DNA. Guilt didn't go away. It moved. People today don't confess their sins to priests anymore, but they still feel shame, anxiety, and the need to watch themselves. The medieval fear of being judged became the modern fear of failing. The notion that there exists an inherent flaw within the self endured. Adam's shadow reached into the field of psychology. Freud would talk about conflict within. Modern therapy would deal with guilt, repression, and control. The words changed. The structure stayed the same. Culture, too, kept the legacy alive. Stories continued to frame humanity as dangerous without limits. Power needed to be watched. Desire needed boundaries. The fear of going back to Eden never fully went away. But something important also came up. As inherited guilt lost its absolute power, the burden of responsibility began to change. People began to inquire not only about the reasons for human failure, but also about the means of effecting change. Resignation was replaced by reform. Endurance was replaced by progress. The world was no longer just a place to live. It turned into something to mold. But the stress never went away completely. People today still have trouble balancing freedom and control, trust and fear, and hope and suspicion. Adam's sin no longer openly defines civilization, but its logic still speaks softly. It asks if people can be trusted to be free. If desire makes things better or worse. Order, does it protect or suffocate? The answer in the Middle Ages was clear. People are still talking about the modern answer, and that leads us to the last thought, not a conclusion, but a question that spans centuries. For hundreds of years, people used Adam's sin as an explanation, a way to deal with pain, a response to fear, an answer to why the world seemed broken. But as we look back at the Middle Ages, we see another possibility. What if Adam's sin did more than just explain the world? What if it put it in order? The world in the Middle Ages was hard, dangerous, and unstable. Life was short. There was always disease. There was a lot of violence. People needed meaning that would last through chaos. Adam's story gave that meaning. It explained why there was pain, why authority was important, why it was safer to follow orders than to be free. It turned pain